The semantic web aims to improve the relationship between data and knowledge by making online resources more human and machine readable. Professor Patrick Carmichael, the principal investigator of the Ensemble project, describes how he introduced teachers and students to the semantic web toolkit.
What we set out to do was to try and take the ideas of the semantic web and the idea of a better connected web into classroom settings and ask teachers and students what they would do with it. There are areas of the curriculum where the fields are changing so quickly, or they're so contested, or they're just so complex that it's very difficult to actually sit down and write a set curriculum which will be relevant and up to date and will be sufficiently authentic that students want to engage with it. And in those kind of settings, what you find is that the kind of pedagogy of choice seems to be some kind of problem-based learning or case-based learning or project-based learning.
The Ensemble project made and adapted tools for a range of higher education courses, including education studies, contemporary dance and geoscience. Each semantic web application contained a visualization tool and the capability to tag new data.
Education studies is a very good example because it's an intrinsically interdisciplinary subject. So we teach about the 1870 Education Act using examples of real documents from the time, and then we can also look at things like the architecture of the board schools which were built shortly after the Education Act in 1870 and how those reflect the pedagogy of the time. In contemporary dance, the discipline itself was already changing, and one of the ways that it was changing was by using a lot more multimedia, using a lot more digital audio, digital video. So what we tried to do there was to say, well, which bits of the semantic web toolkit would help you join all of these bits up? And what emerged from that was they wanted ways not just to sort their photographs out, but to annotate them, to pick segments out of videos, to combine them in new ways, to review their practice, and to make sort of multimedia portfolios. Geosciences as a discipline is changing, so the students also have access to global scale data sets, remote sensing data, enormous photo galleries, historical data as well. And the challenge there is for them to make sense of their local observations against this sort of global context. So once again, we have this idea of bringing data in from across the web, but also allowing students to actually contribute their own content as well.
Data that nobody can look at is of limited use. And so there need to be ways to explain how the information ought to be presented to people. Fundamentally, anybody can say, well, yes, I've got this data and it has some latitudes and longitudes and I'd like to show them on a map. That's very easy to describe, and so it should also be easy for somebody to cause that to happen.
We are really looking for settings where the kind of knowledge that is being taught is quite complex.
It's about allowing people to engage with complexity and recognize, in some cases, the kind of hidden complexities behind things that they take for granted.
You're genuinely doing things that no one's really done before, and you can't go and get a book on it because, well, nobody knows about it, so it's like we'll make it up.
In all of the applications that we've ended up developing, there's been a sense of best of both worlds. On the one hand, there is that student interest in generating content themselves. You also have, if you like, the teacher perspective of wanting to bring in the high quality, authoritative data sets and resources from around the web. It's where those two meet in the middle that you get some of the really interesting dialogue starting to happen about, well, what can these technologies do for us?
People ought to be able to define their own information structures, manage them the way that they want, without having to be computer programmers. If I can somehow convince the world of this fact and cause lots of tools to be built that enable people to do this with their information, well, we will have improved the world.
I think the most important legacy of the project will be if we can get teachers and students to be confidently using a raft of new technologies and to think of themselves as more independent teachers and learners who are able to experiment and work with all of the resources that are out there on the web.
High five.
Something worked?
Yeah. It's a sad display of happiness for something that works.